Then he said to them, "Whose head is this, and whose title?" They answered, "The emperor's." Then he said to them, "Give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." This is one of the most famous, misunderstood passages in the Gospels, although goodness knows there are plenty of them to pick from. Jesus is seriously ticked off at the people who ask him about the lawfulness of this tax. He knows perfectly well that they're not really interested in that particular question, but they're ganging up on him to get him into some major trouble, maybe with the Romans, maybe with the local Jewish community. Either one will do nicely, and get him out of the way of their own agenda, which is seriously threatened by the things that Jesus is telling the lower classes about God's kingdom. The Herodians in the passage are the collaborators with the Roman overlords. The Romans believed, you see, in keeping subject peoples obedient by installing a local family as Rome's deputies. They were responsible for collecting taxes and keeping the peace and making sure that there was no trouble for Rome. And in return, they got special privileges and royal status. The Pharisees, on the other hand, were the popular religious teachers of the time, although they were not in charge of temple worship. Pharisees opposed Roman rule, as far as they dared anyway, and kept things lively by reminding the people constantly that the day would come when all Jews were free of all oppression and the kingdom of Israel would be restored. So when the Herodians and the Pharisees get together to sweet-talk Jesus into letting his guard slip, well, Jesus is no fool and he knows that something's going on. The coin that they were talking about had Caesar's head on it with an inscription to say that Caesar was the son of a god. For Jews of any theological persuasion, that piece of money itself was an insult. It was saying, this is what God looks like. And remember, graven images were a big no-no. And guess what? God looks like the oppressor of Israel. But Jesus, who understands all of this, refuses to be stampeded. He's already told 3 parables that turn all the social structures that they understand on their heads. The son who mouthed off at his father turns out to be the one who is a faithful worker in his father's vineyard, and the owner of the vineyard, different vineyard, will destroy his murderous tenants and set others in their place, and the king will invite all the local riffraff to his son's wedding reception. Jesus has told these parables to needle the establishment, the religious and social powers that be, and tell them that they've got it wrong, that God is there for the dregs of society just as much as, and maybe even more than, God is there for the respectable, God-fearing, complacent types. Now, with our specifically American understanding about the separation of church and state, we're inclined to read this passage in a way that reinforces our tendency, and we all do it, to draw our lives into tight little compartments. Our private lives over here, which we're free to devote to God or not, and our public lives over here, where we acknowledge that our own modern emperor or Caesar has at least some claim on our time and service and money. But go back to the story for a minute. That coin they were staring at was the emblem of a whole regime. Kings issued coins, and it was one of the signs of stable government. So go ahead, Jesus tells them. It's Caesar's coin. It has his picture on it. It obviously belongs to him. So hand it over whenever he asks for it, and then get busy with the real stuff, the stuff that's God's. All Jews, whatever they thought about the Roman occupation, knew the story of creation as well as we do, maybe better. They knew that they were formed in the image of God, and that they were God's emblems to the rest of the world, not because God loved them more than he loved other people, but because this was their particular ministry to the world, to show the world what God is and what the world itself is. Well, this is the business of the church too, to show what God is because we show the world what Jesus Christ is. All that stuff about rendering to Caesar, we can argue about that all day long. Rendering to Caesar is really an argument about humans' power over each other and their ability to enforce their wishes. And that's true whether you approve of what the present government does or not. We come to terms with the power of the Caesars of our time, working out what is acceptable and what we just can't stomach. But that's the point. We come to terms. Because Caesar, all Caesars, are human and fallible at the best and corrupt at the worst. But God is none of those things. And our primary allegiance is to God, who created us and loves us and calls us to a place in his kingdom. This is not about our private affections and inclinations. This is about how we are faithful to God's commands. And we know what those commands are. To love God with everything we've got, heart and soul and mind and strength, and to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. Now notice two things here. Jesus calls these commands, first of all. Not guidelines, not ethical debating points, not mottos or bumper stickers or fortune cookie fortunes. These are commands. We cannot acknowledge God as supreme. It isn't possible unless we also acknowledge God's total claim on every bit of our nerve and our imagination and our intelligence, all to be used to care for the least of these because they are God's especial care. And so, in the barest, most literal sense, our only choice is whether we acknowledge that God is our God. If we do, we serve in the way that God commands us to serve. And if we don't, we're making ourselves God in God's place. He'll never force us to choose him. But neither is he going to allow us to get away with pretending that we're his followers while we're silent in the face of cruelty and corruption. Second, these are not equal claims, God's and Caesar's. God's claim is for everything we've got, yes, and sometimes Caesar makes that same claim. But we're not here to balance those claims and take a bit from here and put it over here to make the scales balance and keep them from tilting. We're here to serve God with Caesar when we can, and to refuse and oppose Caesar when we must. Because Caesar is God's servant too. No more and no less than we are. You can see this in today's first lesson when God calls Cyrus, a pagan king from Persia, his anointed one. Cyrus probably knew not one thing about the God of Israel, but God speaks to Cyrus to tell him that he is Cyrus's God just the same. And getting back to Matthew, as usual, Jesus leaves us with a bunch of unanswered questions. It's a very annoying habit of his not to give a straight answer to the questions that he's asked in the Gospels. But he tells us that our scorecards, our scales, are only tools. They're not ends in themselves. The end in itself is God's end, that the whole world will be healthy and whole, and as today's collect reminds us, full of his glory among the nations. That outcome is assured already. That was taken care of at Golgotha and then on the resurrection morning. But our own part in God's kingdom is ours to accept or reject. All of us have an inner list that keeps us awake at night, wondering how God is involved, or even whether God is involved with the things that are on our minds. Things like decent, affordable medical care, and abortion, and climate change, and the place guns have in our society, and war. Your list is probably different from mine. But whatever is on your list or mine, Jesus is not going to send out a memo that sets out the steps for dealing with a particular problem. That's not how he works. Just ask those Herodians and Pharisees. Instead, Jesus hits the reset button and moves the discussion away from a political or religious tit for tat so that instead we tussle with something much bigger. And we have to tussle with something much bigger, but we don't have to do it alone. In a couple of weeks, we'll be able for the first time in months to receive Christ's body together in the flesh here at St. Anne's. We're just one local church out of more than 150 in Tift County alone, and out of thousands in this country and out of millions throughout the world. And yet, when we get together, this is the something bigger, the foretaste of the consummation of God's kingdom. And at that consummation, everyone will gather at God's table. Till then, it is our great privilege and our great challenge to give to God the things that are God's, to be God's coins, tossed throughout the world joyfully and recklessly and freely, to spread his image all over the place until we're gathered up at the last great day. Amen.